We're live here now that our guests have started to come in. So thank everybody for joining us this afternoon on what's, I guess, the second day of lockdown, at least in Toronto, and in a year that doesn't seem to want to end. But I'm hoping everybody's finding a way to be safe and bring a bit of joy into your lives. As I am an American who is now a proud Canadian, but this week is my favorite national holiday, American Thanksgiving. And so we're trying to figure out how we celebrate that, which is usually happens with a lot of friends and family, but this year, not so much. And a couple of quick tech housekeeping notes. You'll notice that everyone is muted and you can't unmute yourself. We had over 100 people RSVP to today's event and want to keep the space safe for everyone. Later, we'll have a Q&A session, and at that point, you will have a chance to ask your questions through the chat function. We also invite you now to, we'll open up the chat. So if you'd like, we'd love for you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just maybe say where you're joining us from. If you're with an organization, would love to hear from you. Okay, great. It looks like most folks have joined. My name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. And I'd like to thank the Faculty of Arts and the School of Journalism for helping to organize this event. I am joined today by David Mackay, who teaches in the School of Journalism here. And he will be introducing our speaker shortly and then helping share some of his reflections on the event as we wrap up. Our mission here at the Democratic Engagement Exchange is simple: build a vibrant and truly inclusive democracy in Canada. But that simple mission is not easy and is only possible when we bring together community folks, great scholars, and committed public servants to develop tools and resources for those of us who get to work with people whose voices are too often not part of our political process. And many of those same voices are the people who are today hailed as heroes on the front lines fighting this pandemic. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please visit our website at engagedemocracy.ca or follow us at RUEngageX and join our network of organizations and community leaders with a shared commitment to building democracy for all Canadians. We literally cannot do this without you. Much of the work we do is about demystifying voting and democratic engagement more broadly. We are fortunate here in Canada that, unlike in my country of origin, voting for most people is easy. The hard part is deciding who to vote for, because democracy doesn't just need more voters, it actually needs people who make well-informed decisions and choose leaders who will support policies and approaches to governing that will help them build the future they dream of. And as we've seen in the South, that can be challenging. So before I begin our conversation and I ask David to introduce our guests, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. And the land that I have the privilege to call home is sacred land. It's a site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. This land where I live and work is the territory of the Haudenosaunee nations, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca, as well as the Anishinaabe, and most recently visited by the Mississaugas of New Credit. The territory later became the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources and relationships around the Great Lakes. And at this moment, I am powerfully reminded of the wisdom of this covenant and that our presence here relies on all of us to take action for the collective good. I am committed to doing what I am able to support my community in this time of great need and in the future so that generations that come after me can also enjoy this land. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to David Mackay to welcome our guests.
Well, thanks a lot for that. The fact that we're still talking about the election, I think, speaks to the very dysfunction that we've been witnessing for the past several months. And maybe there will be a concession today, maybe there won't be. But I think that concession or not, we're sort of doomed to talk about the fallout from the Trump administration for some time to come. And, to a degree, how we in Canada will be affected by this. I think there are ways that we are already being affected. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. The class that I teach on political affairs has been, we've dug into this topic for several weeks now. I hope many of my students are participating in this. I've recognized at least one name so far, but I'm eager to hear what Farah and Josh have to say. So what I will do is I will let them introduce themselves and then we can kick this thing off. So take it away. Why don't we, ladies first, Farah.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Ryerson, for having me. My name is Farah Nasser. I am a journalist, a news anchor in Toronto. I anchor global news, but I do a lot of work in the space of race, of inequality, and that's probably what I'm most passionate about, as well as politics. I've been lucky to cover politics on every level here in Canada, as well as moderate the leaders' debate here in Ontario during the last election and the only mayoral debate that happened in Toronto. So I've had a bit of a view here on elections, and this is my first time covering an American election from the US, from Washington. I covered them from here, but it was a very different experience. So Josh has been following the campaigns for a while, but you'll get a bit of more of a perspective of a newbie, at least in terms of that, but it was an enlightening experience and something that I think showed us a lot of what is happening there and the divide that's happening south of the border and what we're seeing here as well creep into here. So we'll get into it a bit more, but I'll send it over to Josh now.
That was great. Now I try to live up to that intro. Nice job, Farah. And thank you, John, for the introduction and the acknowledgement. David, thank you as well. My name's Josh Wingrove. I'm a White House reporter at Bloomberg. I'm a Canadian. I don't want to oversell my experience with Farah. I was a newbie too. This is my first time covering a U.S. election as a White House reporter. Obviously, pretty memorable, shall we say, election is still sort of simmering on. I've been with Bloomberg since 2015. I used to cover Canadian government in Ottawa, first Harper, then Trudeau. I was at the Globe and Mail before that, worked in Ottawa and Alberta, which is my home province, and in Toronto, where I went to Ryerson and graduated in 2008, which seems like only a few years ago, but it's increasingly in the rearview mirror. So looking forward to it, looking forward to taking your questions on the differences between the Canadian and US elections and this one in particular. Even today, we're waiting to see whether President Trump will formally concede, and there's no end to the intrigue, I suppose.
Thank you very much, both, for joining us. And I'm particularly interested in your experience as folks, as foreign correspondents working in the U.S. Now, know, Josh, that you're working for a U.S.-based, news organization, but as someone who emigrated from the United States to Canada in 2008, I think there's a fresh perspective that's actually incredibly valuable and incredibly helpful. And so that new experience and that new perspective you bring actually, I think, can give us some really valuable insights. So my first question is sort of what surprised you most about journalism and political coverage in the US and, in your experience covering from there that disconnected from your expectation. And Farah, maybe start with you on that because you're the newest in terms of your impressions, and then turn it over to Josh.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I had a choice to kind of fly into Washington and cover the election, but I thought it would be better to just kind of drive through the United States, drive through Pennsylvania, New York, and really understand some of the issues that were going on. And in doing that, I think what struck me the most was the level of engagement. And I think the United States in a lot of ways is very different. Some will say, I was speaking to somebody yesterday who was telling me that, well, they're definitely more patriotic. But I think it's even beyond that. Like when Americans, they talk about the leader, no matter what side they're on. I mean, they'll say commander in chief. Like we would never say, commander of the armed forces here in Canada, right? So I think it's a rally behind the flag. There's a real different view around elections. And I think we have quite a bit to go when it comes to that level of engagement with our elections. And perhaps that's not maybe a fair statement given how high stakes this election and perhaps the previous one were. But I think the voter turnout was incredible, but it didn't almost surprise me in a way, because it was really awestruck by not just signs, but just how everybody wanted to talk about this, and really the level of when I got to Washington, or even in the States, I mean, the level of anxiety that was palpable in these areas, it was almost like people were just kind of living through it in a different way than we do here during the election. So it was quite eye-opening.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. If we're driving through Pennsylvania, you can see pretty much every part of the U.S. in a way. Pennsylvania is a pretty diverse place. The U.S. media environment is so polarized, and I've never been able to sort out yet which is the chicken and which is the egg in terms of polarized politics and polarized media environment. It's a lot different down here, and that leads, I think, to the election coverage in the U.S. tends to almost feel at times like college football, where people are cheering for their team. Farah is absolutely right. I mean, folks down here take it so like deeply personal in a way that we just don't see. I mean, I live in DC. When Biden was projected as the winner, well, I think it was Saturday morning. People were screaming and honking in the streets. I do not ever remember that in Canada to the same extent. So it's just different. It's difficult sometimes down here to try to find coverage that sort of calls balls and strikes. Fox is obviously pretty sympathetic to the Republican Party. MSNBC and to a lesser extent CNN are pretty sympathetic, I think, to the Democratic Party in a lot of their programming, not all, but a lot. That's a little different, although of course in Canada people have views that certain networks lean particular ways. But I think it's just everything is sort of juiced up in the States a lot more, and the turnout really is the battle, because I think there's just a lot of evidence we overstate how many people actually switch their votes in the States, and the number of people who split their votes, which means they vote for one party for president, maybe the other for a senator, is declining. So, you just have people sort of on converging roads to voting all Democrat or all Republican all the time. And then it's just a question of which one of them turns up. And that's really what the struggle over the election results has been, with Trump disputing who showed up, because he's trying to discredit these mail-in ballots, states that he lost.
Yeah, and in terms of coverage, I mean, one of the things that I'm struck by is that you have these, as you both described, hyper sort of engaged and energized electorate. At the same time, a higher percentage of Canadians voted in the last federal election, which many thought was going to be boring, just maybe 1% more, but still, it was a very different situation there. And so in terms of coverage, like, do you think how do you deal with the disconnect with the folks who are, whatever percentage they are, maybe a third or a half of Americans who are hyper engaged, and another significant chunk who are just not engaged at all? Does that enter even into the equation of how coverage is handled?
Well, it's a lot harder to vote in the US than in Canada, generally speaking. I mean, I can't remember the longest time I waited to vote in Canada, 10 minutes, something like that. It would be in that ballpark. Whereas in Americans, hours is very normal to wait. And then you add on top of that the issues of race, where disproportionately this happens to be the case in cities, where of course disproportionately the voting groups tend to be not as white as in rural communities. And so voter access, I think, is the answer to a lot of that question. Just makes it's not as easy typically in the States, which is why the changes that facilitated mail-in voting were viewed by Democrats is long overdue and welcome, because because of the pandemic, you weren't going to force people to roll the dice on their health to go cast their ballot. But B, there might be other reasons why people couldn't come and vote, including that they're shift workers and, maybe their employer has to give them time off but doesn't really like to, or they feel they'll be punished for it or whatever, or they're scared to vote one way or the other. America's a polarized country nationally, but its communities aren't. It's like a collection of unpolarized communities. People live in Democratic cities or Republican cities or towns or whatever. People tend to actually live around people that vote the same way as them, which isn't really the same way in Canada also. So there might be a sense of folks thinking, well, my vote won't make that much of a difference. I live in a gerrymandered district. The Republicans are going to win it anyway.
And Farah, as you think, like when you're covering Canadian politics, and who are you thinking is the audience for your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's we saw in the last election. I mean, we talk about the United States being divided. Let's not forget the regional divides we saw after the last election. I mean, we saw provinces that were totally one way, and others where we saw cities, large cities that were the total other way. Like it was literally a geographically divided country. And that's, I think, something that's really important to remember. And it's sometimes hard to remember when you're doing certain stories, especially when you're doing them from big cities, that there are people who have a completely different viewpoint. I mean, you talked about Pennsylvania, and I know Josh has said before, it was, what did you say, Josh? It was Philadelphia and it was Alabama. Say it again, sorry.
Yeah, James Carville calls Pennsylvania Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between.
And I think that's just such a great way to put it over there. But here we also have, I mean, a real divide between towns and cities. And I think we have to really remember that when we're doing our political coverage. And it's something that we try to keep in mind, especially during the last election, because again, we saw that divisive rhetoric as well happening here.
Mm-hmm. And so unpack that for us a little bit. What does that look like when you're making decisions about stories to cover or questions to ask, you're preparing for a debate or you're preparing for an interview? How does that impact what you're thinking about? Do you think about your audience, who you're asking on behalf of, and what does that look like?
Certainly. And I think in the time of social media, it's very easy to see where the barometer is, at least on social media.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to
best measure. Yeah. It's not the best measure, obviously, of the public, since it's, mostly journalists on Twitter. But I think, you get a little bit of an indication, at least, on things where people don't agree with you. And that's why I try to really follow people or watch things that give me an alternate view, as difficult as it is sometimes, especially when it comes to race. I think it's really important to understand where the other side is coming from and have this type of like intellectual humility, like be okay with being an I don't know it all, like it's just, this is this person's point, this is how this person feels. And I think it's really hard to sometimes sum that all up when you only get a few questions, especially in this time of a pandemic when we aren't able to do, scrums and things like that. But it's really trying to kind of get that balance and get that viewpoint from different places that are not your own, that I think is so critical right now. We talk about, journalism, holding those account, but I think one real tenet in journalism that we don't pay enough attention to and is more important now than ever is offering perspective, understanding other perspectives than our own, because that's crucial right now.
And so you thought my next question is on about social media, and obviously we have a current president of the United States who, just dictated political coverage to some degree through his use of Twitter and social media, but it is a very narrow world, especially the Twitter world, and Instagram has its own little right, unique elements. And then Facebook, is this other challenging environment. And so, both of you has been in the business long enough to see changes as a result of that. So Josh, maybe we can start with you, talking about how political reporting has impacted, because you write news stories, and has social media changed how you write your stories, how you present your content, and work in that world? and for better or worse.
Yeah, well, so it doesn't feel like for better too often. Yeah, I think, let me break that into, I think, 3 groups. Number one, Trump. I mean, he tweets all the time. I have alerts, like every White House reporter is set up for his tweets. Usually he's already been tweeting when I wake up in the morning. Today it was several retweets of Randy Quaid. So, anything goes with that. We write a lot of stories off his tweets because it's an unprecedented bully pulpit for a president. In fact, adversary nations used to put a lot of energy into things like, gee, what's the president's mood today? That's something the Russians would like to know. Pretty easy to sort out what the president's mood is these days. So that's number one. Number two, the sort of just stream of news, things break on Twitter all the time. I mean, it is the new newswire in ways. Instagram, not so much, but, it has its distinct use. So you just have to be on it, and it blows apart any notion of downtime. And the third, from a just nuts and bolts journalism perspective, particularly for the folks here who are journalism students, is social media is just another way to contact people. It's that basic. And if you're whether it's source development or what Farah said about reaching out to people whose perspective is not being really served in coverage, it's just an easy way to get a hold of people or to message them privately, sliding into sources' DMs, as it were, in a professional sense, that helps. It's any way you have to kind of meet the source where they are. And if there's someone that likes talking on the phone, great. If there's someone who likes texting, great. If there's someone that likes firing back and forth in your DMs, that you got to be there. So social media is just another pathway to reach people, either sources like influential folks, or people who have stuff to leak, or just everyday folks or professors or whose perspective you're trying to use to inform your coverage to make it the best story it can be.
But has it impacted the way you actually write and report your stories, do you think?
In terms of structure, probably not. Obviously news organizations do all kinds of things on the back end in terms of SEO. They want their stories to pop up on their Google searches, and they want snappy headlines to take off on Twitter, boost engagement, that kind of thing. But no, I think news is news. We embed tweets and stories now, that kind of thing. That's about it. But the pace is quickening. I think Trudeau once said something like, things are moving more faster than they'd ever have before, and they'll never be this slow again. I don't know who it was said that, but it stuck in my mind because it's true in news. It's like every year it feels like things are moving faster and faster and faster. Although maybe Joe Biden might pump the brakes a little bit on that. As an example here, they used to call a lid in America. That means, like on the Obama White House, they'd call a lid. It means you could go home, you could have dinner. There wasn't going to be news. Now they only call a travel photo lid, which means that Trump is not traveling anywhere and he's not doing any photo ops. But they can't guarantee that he won't fire off news on Twitter. They simply can't call a full lid anymore, just because of the nature of social media.
Farah, what have you seen in terms of the way you report?
I think just one quick point to add, contacting people on social media is great, but keep in mind that those same people are watching your social media. So one story I really wanted to tell was there was a group called Muslims for Trump. And I was fascinated by, what their reasoning was. And actually I got some interesting answers off the record, but they looked at my past tweets and my past things that I'd seen, and they declined an interview because they didn't think that I would give them, a fair and balanced interview. So just keep in mind that also happens, right? That you're also being judged on the other end of social media when you're trying to get an interview or uncover a story. But I find for me, you talked about, coverage and kind of giving people a voice that might not have a voice or a different perspective. I mean, we have this issue in Canada of like news deserts, right? So there are places in this country that don't don't have local news coverage. And those people, where do they get their news from then, right? They go on social media. And then sometimes they see news that's not accurate, right? And they believe that. They believe that fake news because they're not being served by the traditional news interests. So I think for me, at least, I found our jobs, yeah, there is a flow of information, but it's certainly challenging to try to decipher between that information. It's challenging for the general public, but it's challenging for journalists to authenticate. I mean, when videos can be doctored so well that you watch something and it just seems so believable. I mean, that's a difficult place to be. That's a difficult world to be in, and it's going to get even harder. I also think that people need to realize on social media when they're watching news, like I know we have paywalls up and you have to, pay for news sometimes, and not everybody's a big fan of that. And I get that because some people can't pay for the news. But when you're not paying for it, you're the product. So you have to keep that in mind, right? You are the one that social media companies are kind of capitalizing on. And these algorithms want you to stay longer and longer in a place. So it's hard to kind of compete with that as well at the same time. So it's just certainly made our jobs a lot harder and coverage a lot harder.
Yeah, and I would definitely plug, everybody should subscribe and pay for journalism. Great journalism does not come free, and we all benefit from it. So I would reiterate that. And I guess the other thing that I want to follow up there, though, is on this concept of trust and how we build trust in all of our institutions, but our journalism. Because, Josh, you spoke at the very beginning to the hyper-polarization and partisanship within the media landscape in the US, which I don't think has arrived in Canada, and certainly not in the same way. And there is, lots of polling shows, but, trust in media is much higher in Canada than in the US. And how do we maintain that and avoid that hyper-partisanship? And obviously in the U.S. you've had a president and to some degree a political party who has run literally on demonizing our journalists and journalism more generally. I don't think we've seen that the same way here either. But if you can say, the question, how do we avoid some of those pieces that has happened in the US, or is it inevitable that we're going to be going there? And maybe Josh, I'd throw it to you first.
I worry that Canada is on a similar path, sort of more balkanization of news coverage that will sort of lead to that. When we cover the rally, Bloomberg is in the pool, so that means we travel with Trump. And when we arrive at these rallies, and we'd like dump out of the plane, we run, get our little laptops set up, get ready to peck away on our laptops, and we're in a pen, and people are just leaning in, and they'll scream things like fake news. They just Trump will gesture towards the cameras saying, oh, look, the fake news is here. He says, oh, they just cut away, which they haven't. So he really has brought the media into the sort of battle. The media are an enemy in the story Trump is telling to his supporters. That's just the reality of the situation the press have to deal with down here. And now, if he doesn't like what he sees, he stokes his supporters to other things. We're seeing that with Fox, which, I mean, if you think Fox is anti-Trump, but he does, and he's pushing them to farther right options like Newsmax and OAN that are, often really sort of peddling in just extreme right news or commentary. So it's I think becoming even more polarized in the States. I don't know what the solution is in Canada. As far as thoughts on news deserts, I think are really crucial. A lot of folks don't think that there's any coverage of their community because often there isn't. And it's problematic. I will say that some Republicans are great with the press. They talk, particularly in Congress, it's not a one-party issue, and some of the most stonewalling senators are Democrats. So the press skepticism is on both sides of the aisle in America. A lot of supporters of AOC, for instance, would tell you that they don't think the press give the progressive wing of the party a fair shake. And a lot of supporters of Ted Cruz, for example, would say that Republicans don't get a fair shake in the press. So you're kind of trapped in the middle.
Can I jump in there just for a second? Because I think what was interesting is this election, as opposed to others, we weren't allowed to go places, right, in Washington. So I spent a lot of time, I did some interviews, but I spent a lot of time in my hotel room just flipping between Fox and CNN and MSNBC. And I was really struck at the level of almost ridicule. Like, so there'd be something on CNN and then Fox would screen grab that and then show that and make fun of it. And then CNN would screen grab that and then make fun of it. And it was like they were obsessed with each other. And I just thought to myself, like, what purpose does this serve? Like, who is this serving besides these two organizations trying to defend themselves? Like, let's just talk about the news. What happened today? And I know I mean, it must be really difficult to be an American commentator, especially going through 4 years of Trump. I mean, it felt like Jake Tapper, when it was announced, like it was like this moment where the trauma was almost lifted. Like he almost was so happy, his voice was breaking up. It was like, it was a traumatic experience these past 4 years. So I mean, I'm sure it's very difficult, but when you're ridiculing another side as the media, it doesn't really further what our kind of purpose is. What we're here to inform, we're here to give facts. And I think there's a real tricky balance in this area where we're teetering right now, right? Where some people are are mixing up opinions, and we're also not doing a very good job at teaching people what's the difference between a columnist, what's the difference between an editorial, what's the difference between CNN at night, like a Don Lemon, versus during the day. We're not telling people that. So they're thinking, okay, well, the media is biased. Well, yeah, there are commentators that are going to give their viewpoint, but the media, as a plural lens, is obviously, made up of many, many different factions. So I think that has to really be looked at here. I think Canada is a lot more liberal than the United States generally, so I don't know if it's going to work here. I also know that we've had tries at kind of more of a right-wing approach to news that have not worked. So, or an opinionated approach to news. So I'm worried, but I also kind of trust what's happening here. We just do have to be careful.
But I assume that, as a news organization, as global, you're in a competitive environment with other news organizations. How do what do you feel in terms of pressure to distinguish your voice and the voice of global from other news organizations?
To me, I don't even think about the others. I just kind of let my work speak for itself, but I've been criticized. I mean, as I said, I do a lot of work on race. I do a lot of work on inequality. And to me, it's holding a mirror to society and saying, this is what's happening. We have an issue, but I did a story on, I was telling you all before the call that, I did a story on discrimination in hockey, and the amount of hate mail I got about that subject because people didn't want to hear it. So sometimes people will not want to hear things that are actually accurate when you look at percentages and things like that, because they feel like you're being biased. But in the end, it's that people don't want to acknowledge what's happening. And I think there's a real difference there, and that's challenging. But comparing to other networks, I mean, we just do the work we do in the end.
Right. So you're not feeling that like you're monitoring what other folks are doing and having to respond in the same way that Josh was describing with CNN and Fox, like literally, mocking each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think we look at what other stations are doing, and we're looking at, what stories they're kind of covering and what's working for them. But I think at the end of the day, we don't like start our morning editorial meeting saying, okay, what did CTV do? What did CBC do? No, we're just like, let's reflect this city. Let's find out what's happening. What are the big issues? What do people need to know re-COVID? And we just kind of go from there and do it that way.
All right, I want to make sure we give ourselves some time to have folks who showed up today ask questions. So everybody who's here with us, if you can send your questions through the chat to Jacqueline, you'll see the ability, you should have in the chat there, to send questions, and Jacqueline will then be able to answer questions and make sure we can get to as many as possible. So please, yeah, Jacqueline's waving here, and she will monitor that. So and we, as mentioned, we have a number of students from Ryerson, and I think other folks who are interested in the field of journalism. So I don't want to, as folks send in their questions, just ask one question about that. For both of you, quickly, what's your favorite part about your job? And what would you rather someone else did? And if I could give a piece of my job to someone else to do every day, this is what I'd love them to do.
All right, you take that one.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start with the front row ticket to history, which every journalist will tell you. Like, I think that's the coolest part of our job, having these experiences and conversations. I mean, you wouldn't go out to people on the street and just ask them their opinion, but we do that, and we learn so much about the world. I think the challenge is sometimes people think that you're doing things for your own self-interest, where it's like you really work so hard, and then you get 3 emails. One will say your right wing is showing, one will say you're a leftist hack, and one will say you're fake news. And then you're like, oh God, what have I done? But maybe you're doing something right if everybody thinks that you're seeing it the wrong way.
Yeah, the learning for sure is my favorite part. Every day you learn new stuff. And that's just exhilarating. If I could punt one thing to anyone else, it would be transcribing, which is every print journalist's cross to bear. But the apps that they have now are better, and they get better every year, but they're still not quite 100%. So I spend a lot of my time just doing old school transcribing of what a certain president says, because he often has quotable quotes, shall we say. So yeah, that would be one that I could punt. But I mean, I just feel like blessed to have this job. It's intoxicating. I genuinely have no idea what else I would do other than this. So I feel blessed to have this.
That's great. All right. Well, so Jacqueline, I'm going to turn it over to you now. I see we started to get questions in, and if you would like to handle that, great.
We've got a lot of questions coming in. So someone has asked a question on behalf of the RSJ newsletter, the reporter who is here covering this event for us. What do you think can be done to reduce political polarization in Canada?
Josh, do you want to start with that one?
I don't know that that's necessarily a goal. Like, people are polarized because they think that one party isn't speaking to them. So it's kind of the way the system is supposed to work a little bit. I think Canada is blessed to have more than one political party for people to go to. That helps avoid the overall polarization that the US has, where people are forced basically to pick between A or B. I think that's a big difference. A lot of the political polarization in Canada is it's regional polarization masquerading as political polarization. I don't think any change to the electoral process will do that. I think that one thing that Canada really has going for it is the nonpartisan election boundaries. That is not the case in America. It varies by state, but generally the districts in Congress are just weird shaped puzzle pieces. So I think Canada having sort of nonpartisan boundaries that doesn't lump power disproportionately too much is I think a positive thing.
I would say transparency. I think that's the big thing. I think we have to know, especially right now with even COVID, for example, what our leaders are doing, how they're doing it, how decisions are being made. I mean, we have in this province, in the province of Ontario, doctors complaining about the Ford government and how they've made decisions on what closes and what doesn't. And we still haven't got details on who told who when and that kind of thing, who told who, what, when.
Yeah.
So I think that's really key, but I think it's also key for us to be transparent, to us as members of the media, to again explain what the difference is in our coverage and how we've come to a story. So I think that's really important. And I know Josh is saying that the responsibility isn't on us to kind of stop polarization, but I do think we shouldn't be adding to it. And I think that the big thing, like I said, in the States, when you have commentators that are just kind of fueling the fire in media, I think the media should bear some responsibility in the States for what's happening. So yeah, I don't think that we should be adding to the problem. Yeah,
I would just add one thing, like Farah's point about the nighttime and daytime being a lot different in the US, that's very true. And if you keep CNN or Fox on for a few hours, it bleeds from news into commentary, and you blink and you miss it, and suddenly you're in full commentary mode, and it's easy to kind of lose perspective of that as the viewer.
I'm going to jump around a little on a question and to go off something that was sort of talked about. What percentage of media coverage is news versus commentary / opinion in Canada versus the US? What's the net effect of this on democracy?
A lot more commentary in the US, I would wager.
Yeah, very little here. I mean, especially television commentary. I mean, you don't see that happening on any of the news channels right now in terms of commentary. We did have it. There was when we were in Ryerson, Josh, there were, some channels that had some commentary. Maybe you could speak to the newspaper aspect of it, because I think that's where we see it more in editorials.
Yeah, I've never been a huge fan of newspaper editorials, sort of unsigned editorials from the newspaper writ large. And I don't know that that's something that has a place in 2020. In the US, it takes its form in sort of alternate media. So you have like sort of new media startups that maybe are conservative or liberal, and they look like news, but they're commentary, or in some cases just made up. And it's difficult for people to discern the difference. I think that is a huge issue. But the commentary side is, I think, there's so much higher. For instance, on Trump's claims about Hunter Biden, you had dueling narratives being put out by the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the Wall Street Journal reporters. The editorial page tends to be more sympathetic to President Trump. The reporters try to be straight shooters, and weird situation. If you're reading only the Wall Street Journal, you wouldn't know what to believe based on whether you're reading the opinion or news side of it. So, but I do think it's higher in the U.S., and that muddies the water.
I think it's also how U.S. media was created. Like back then, when the printing press started, like it was basically companies or organizations that funded newspapers, right? Like that were completely behind. That's how it all started. So they were definitely skewed a certain way. And I think that has had an effect how things are there. The one thing that I'll add that I forgot to say is I think the editorials also come in radio here. I mean, you see a lot of commentators, and it really depends regionally where you are, where you'll get a real varying opinion. But we've also seen commentators who've gotten in trouble, lost their jobs because of some of the things that they've said that have been outright false. And I think that there's, I hope, and I think that there's more, they have more at stake here, where there things kind of get passed, and here it's like people get called out on that kind of thing.
We got a lot of great questions here, Jacqueline. I don't envy your job.
I know, I'm bouncing around a little bit. What are we going to do to address news deserts? How are we reaching out to rural communities?
Farah, you want to?
I honestly, I think the government needs to help a little bit here. I really do. I mean, our industry has changed dramatically. I mean, when an organization like a Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, they don't have to pay like we do here, and our CanCon requirements are not the same. I mean, there's not really a level playing field. So in that sense, I mean, we are really trying hard to cover a lot of the places that don't get coverage, but at the end of the day, there has to be money involved. So I think I personally, and again, this is a personal view, and I'm sure not everybody shares it, but I think the governments have to see that democracy and news is good for everyone. Like it is a facet of democracy, and we need to serve people, especially in a time when information is so critical. Like look where we live right now and how regional of an approach COVID is in different places. People need that information about their community, about where they live, and there's places now where it's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, my first newspaper job as a summer intern between I think second and third year was the Kenora Daily Miner and News in northwestern Ontario. It's papers like that are covering the stuff going on in smaller communities, and it's just a dollars and cents issue. They just don't have the money they used to. Many are shutting down, of course. They have now maybe one reporter putting up the whole paper instead of 4 or 5 that they had 10 years ago. Or 20 years ago. It's just dollars and cents. If you're a business owner, car dealership in a small town, you're probably better off advertising on Facebook or the radio maybe than maybe in print newspaper. At least you think that now. So it's a question about how you get the money to it. I've never really settled on what's the best way. The government has tried to do direct funding of positions in particular in some sort of arm's length capacity in Canada. We haven't had that obviously in the States. I wonder whether the better path might be something in terms of like ad buying, particularly in a pandemic. It's weirded me out. I was back in Ottawa at the beginning of the pandemic, and it weirded me out that I was driving to get my groceries and back, and there weren't radio ads telling me what the rules were. I mean, it's bonkers. Like that I, as a informed sort of journalist, was a little confused as to what the rules were supposed to be. You gotta, like I said earlier, you gotta meet folks where they are. But then government is buying a bunch of ads, and then the newspaper looks like a government ad. So it's just there's no clean solution. But make no mistake about it. It's a dollars and cents issue. It is no more complicated than that. Small towns are losing their papers and TV stations and the staff that run them because they just don't have the money.
Okay, I'm kind of combining two questions here. What are your personal coping mechanisms to sit with the sheer anger and polarization that you were immersed in and tasked with respectfully respecting to the public as journalists? And Farah, if you could speak to how, as a woman of color covering the US election, when you were collecting right-wing voices from right-wing sources, were you ever worried about your safety?
I wasn't actually. It was interesting. And the thing that was particularly fascinating to me, I was more of a concern for my safety, was people who I wanted to interview who wouldn't wear a mask. Mm-hmm. And that was concerning. It was somebody said, I don't believe in masks. And my cameraman quickly said, well, we do. So if you're going to talk to us, you're going to put your mask on. He was so quick. I loved how he responded to that. And I think that was more of a concern. The one thing that I found really interesting in terms of the people who I spoke with were, when we look at Trump supporters, we kind of have a definition in our minds here in Canada, what they're like and who they are and what they look like. And that was so different when I went to the States in many aspects. I met this woman, for example, she was a community mental health nurse. We were talking and I remember thinking, this is somebody I could have coffee with. Like, she's so cool. She's like, and then she started telling me about fake news and how she didn't believe in the media and how Trump is getting his message across on Twitter. And that's the only way to do it. And all this stuff. And it kind of opened my mind a little bit, in a way that maybe hadn't been opened before, because we're so kind of removed for it. We have an assumption. So to answer that question, I did not feel safe when I was there. My coping mechanism, meditation. I do a lot of meditation, and I have 2 little kids, and they kind of get me out of any funk I'm in.
I don't have kids. I have a Schnauzer poodle. That's my coping mechanism. But if anyone has any coping mechanisms, I would welcome it. Definitely. The biggest risk of this election cycle was the COVID risk. I mean, Trump's rallies were thousands of people closely packed together outside, almost always outside, sometimes not. No masks, or very, very few masks. The people behind him who were on camera tended to wear masks. So from when you're watching on TV, it looked like everyone was wearing a mask, but so we had actually had like an N95 tan line after a few rallies in Arizona. Like, I had 2 like white lines from my mask on my face. So that is the bigger fear right now. Otherwise, Americans are actually, like, generally, definitely some are not at all keen on the press, in many ways threaten the press, but Americans are generally more willing to talk to the press than Canadians are. Doing streeters, like just talking to folks, tends to be a lot easier in America than in Canada, where you have to approach 20 people before anyone, says anything. So,
Josh, what do you think is the reason for that? As an American, I am impressed with how friendly Americans are. And not to say anything Canadians, but in contrast, but I think that idea that they're more willing to talk, what do you think's going on there?
First Amendment, baby, it's just a more extroverted culture. I don't know that it's any simpler than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the cultural component is real. Yeah.
Particularly, I mean, like Mike Pence, the vice president, was a radio host for a while. It's a culture of talkers, I think, which can be a blessing some days and an obstacle on other days as a journalist. But it's generally pretty different. I like, again, the rallies. I didn't find them as hostile as you might expect, but they were certainly not overly welcoming to the press. The people tended to calm down if you like we would hand them water bottles, that kind of thing, because it's often hot and they've been waiting forever. And then they're like, oh, you're maybe a human who I don't need to hate, but I hate you anyway. So, all you can do is just try to govern yourself accordingly and hope that folks give you a fair shake, I guess.
So we've got a question related to what was said on the panel about using social media to see and understand what the other sides are saying. How do you do that while recognizing that we often find ourselves in our own echo chambers?
Great question.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
I don't know, like as a pure tactic, I often, find go to folks that are new perspectives to me, and I look at who they're following, and I just go down and follow some of those people, either academics that I didn't know their work, or city level or state level politicians, this kind of thing. So building out this sort of spider web, if you find someone whose perspective you realize you haven't been paying attention to enough, usually they can lead you to new discoveries as well.
Yeah, I follow some people who troll me. Like I follow some people who, and maybe they're bots, I don't know, but there's people who sometimes they have a lot of followers and they have real, thought out criticism. And in that case, they're very surprised. Sometimes I get a private message that'll be like, thanks for the follow, because they don't expect it. But it's difficult. It's not easy, but we have to break these echo chambers, because otherwise, there's really no path forward to really understanding both sides. Otherwise, you're just serving one audience. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's just as simple as that. Just finding, and I mean, these you think Fox is on one side. These ones that you mentioned that are like further on that side are also very interesting to follow some of the things that come out of there.
Yeah, if you're watching some of these networks or just listening to the president's Twitter feed, you have a completely different reality right now than anyone who's watching, literally any other news channel, like not even CNN, MSNBC, but CBS, ABC, whatever. And then you look at the other ones and you start to distrust them, and the story that they're telling, well, in many cases overwhelmingly false, is an exciting story of the president trying to make a comeback on an election that all the data says he lost, but maybe if all these dominoes fall the right way. So then people get really excited and it taps into that part of their brain and they're really jazzed by it. And then they flip into a more like level-headed news story and they think, well, this is boring. And then they think it's false. So it's, I do not know the solution to that, but.
Sorry.
Good tax advice going on here in the chat.
I know there's some great conversations going on in the chat. In what way do you see differences between the Canadian and US version of perpetual campaigning as a tactic / culture?
Josh, you answer that.
The US, for sure. I mean, if you're, the House is up every 2 years, you have like 3 hot seconds after your election before you have to start fundraising for the next one. It's a problem. And of course, in the US, you have this other dynamic, which thankfully we don't have in Canada, of just like dark money groups making it very difficult to find, who is funding what group, how much, can they give, what are the special interests at play here, sort of the ball and cup game where it's just impossible sometimes to discern on the fly who's doing it. So yeah, that's I don't know. Again, I don't know the answer to that one, but I do sense that is one where the US is quite a bit different. And in Canada, like this is more like the Senate. Like the Senate down here tends to be a little calmer because people have been senators forever, and they're like, yeah, like they're only up every 6 years, whatever. This is the case a lot, I think, in the House of Commons, where many of those MPs have been there a really long time, and they just don't get too hot or cold about a lot of things. That comes with its downside as well. But I think that just the political systems lend themselves to being a little a little different, that you don't have the sort of frantic scramble in the House of Representatives where you just are constantly having to get out there, get on TV, get your voice heard, and try to raise money just to buy another 2 years to do it all over again.
I think especially now, like we had this past election, it was hard to find those undecided voters, right? Because people were so on one side or the other side. I think the engagement is long term as well, right? When it comes to our elections, I mean, I laugh at some of the ones who are like, "Oh, this election's going on forever." Well, it's really not if you compare it to a lot of the American elections. But even then, people aren't engaged until the very end here. I find, at least, the whole campaign, we'll be covering it as journalists,
Right.
and at the end, I'll have friends who are like, "Who should I vote for?"
Yeah.
And they haven't really been paying attention to all of the issues along the way. So I think the engagement is very different.
And so we could easily keep going on here, but I do have to be respectful of everyone's time and appreciate that. Like, that's an interesting note for us to end on, in that distinction between these endless elections. And at the end, somebody turning to it. We've all had this happen. Somebody turns to us and said, "Who should we vote for?" And in some ways, I think that's kind of the strength also, because it isn't this hyper polarized, and the political parties know that, which means that a lot more people are available. And you spoke to, I've had the privilege of attending the Eid dinner for the Canadian Muslim vote, and every major political party sends the most senior folks there because they know that audience is available to them. And I think that's one of our strengths. So on an old optimism about that landscape, that political landscape where there is real competition for voters, is great. But to be continued conversation. I want to turn it over to David to wrap it up and thank us and offer his insights in the last few minutes here.
Great conversation. But I thought I would take the liberty of, because I know that some of my students I recognize some of the names, are taking in this conversation. So I'm wondering, Farah and Josh, if you could offer, we talked a lot about, polarization and news deserts and social media and polarization. It's a very tricky world that journalism students who at one point or another are going to be covering politics, either at the federal, provincial, or municipal level. They are going to be covering politics. They need the context. So with that in mind, what would be a piece of advice that either of you would offer to my students or others who are going to be working as journalists in the near future?
I'll jump in. Yeah. Talk to as many people as you can. This will inform your stories. I know it sounds so simple, but if you're, for instance, covering politics and there's a dispute between, let's say, the PCs and the Liberals over something, it might actually be the NDP MP who has a good tip for you. So, like, just as a crude example, but I just talk to as many people as you can, because you never know until you know who's willing to play ball with journalists. Sometimes it's the people you don't think, and sometimes it's extremely the people you think. And B, it just, more perspectives will always inform your reporting. That's why, I think my first reporting day at Ryerson was like doing streeters, right? Like literally the day one, get out there, talk to people. It's back to basics, So I would just remember that as well.
Farah?
Yeah, I think I'll jump off that by saying, talk to community organizations, find out what the issue, go out there. Don't just rely on the politicians who are going to try to spin their story to you. And on that note, find the why out behind everything, because everything, we know this in journalism, has a why behind it. Why are they telling you this? So that's the basic part. But I think there's so many incredible organizations that I've spoken to when it comes to various issues that'll kind of give me the pulse. So sometimes you can't talk to everybody, but at least these, stakeholders when it comes to, a certain community, like you mentioned, the Muslim community, or when it comes to even gun crime, or when it comes to poverty, or what, there's these certain organizations that work, that know this stuff, breathe it in and out, and will love to give you their perspective. So sometimes it's not streeters, but it's these community organizations that'll really open your mind.
Totally.
Well, having worked in broadcast for many, many years, I'm cognizant of the need for a hard out. So we've got about 2 minutes. So Farah and Josh, thank you very much. A fascinating discussion. And John, I'm guessing that we will be posting this this discussion for?
Yes. So so the discussion will, everybody who registered for the event will get a link to the discussion, and we'll be posting it through our Facebook page and also available on our website. Give us a couple of days. We do not have as big a production team maybe as some of these other operations, but we will get it out. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot to everyone, and have a good day, and stay safe.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us with Zoom fatigue, I know.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Josh and Farah. Amazing conversation. There's many follow-ups I would like, but and if you folks, if you two can stay on for just a minute, we'll do a quick thanks again. But
Sure.
Everybody else, thank you all. The Democracy Dialogue series, which this is part of, will continue again starting up in January. So stay tuned for our next round. Democracy isn't just around elections, it's an ongoing thing. So we look forward to engaging everybody. And thanks to the School of Journalism and the Faculty of Arts again for helping to make this event possible. All right, stay safe and have a great whatever kind of holiday season you're able to have.